Hi, Big Cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way podcast, the last one of 2022. This week, we're going to be exploring the unconventional mother-daughter dynamic between Lorelai and Rory that lies at the very heart of this show, and the whole concept of that they're best friends first and mother and daughter second. And we are doing this because their friendship just has always felt genuinely and utterly unique and has always been a part of the larger conversation around alternative models of parenting that we see depicted on television. And for all the talk of teams and guys in their lives, I think the real love story and emotional core has always been Lorelai and Rory. This show was pitched to the WB network as a last-ditch effort where Amy Palladino sort of was just like, what if we do a show about a mother and daughter who are more like best friends? And it was a very vague concept that she pitched at the time, but here we are still talking about it 23 years later because it's such an intriguing relationship.
Before we get started and get too far into this, we would once again like to remind you to do those YouTube-y things. It's a huge help to us when you like and subscribe and comment. And consider this your spoiler warning for the entire series. This topic is core to the premise of the show, so we're going to be jumping all over the place, and we'll inevitably need to talk about some of the biggest moments and reveals in the show for sure. So, that said, let's get into it.
Yep, we're going to start off with our basic episode recaps, and we begin with episode 11 of season 1, Paris is Burning. And in that episode, it just becomes clear that Lorelai, or should I say Rory, is getting used to the idea of Lorelai and Max dating and is getting closer to Max, but Lorelai freaks out and tries to ghost Max because of this. However, when Lorelai goes to Parents' Day at Chilton, she's forced to confront Max, and their passionate kiss in the classroom is overseen by Paris, who spreads the news like wildfire throughout the school to divert attention from her own parents' messy divorce. Max is told that he's putting his career in jeopardy by dating a parent, so Lorelai and Max decide to take a bit of a break to figure out if there's a way to make the relationship work that's not so risky and difficult.
All right, next up is episode 12, Double Date. Lane approaches Rory with a request for her to ask Dean to set up a double date for them with his friend Todd, who Lane is crushing on. Suki is anticipating her first date with Jackson, but his cousin Rune is in town, which puts a wrench in the plans. Oh, Rune. Suki suggests they double date with Rune and Lorelai. Both dates are utter disasters. Todd and Lane have nothing in common, and Rune is surly and taciturn and makes snide comments about Lorelai's height. Mrs. Kim's discovery of Lane's subterfuge to go on a date with a boy her parents haven't approved makes matters worse, and Lane is grounded. But Lorelai goes to Kim's Antiques and has a nice conversation with her that encourages her to loosen the reins a little, because sometimes kids need a little room to make their own choices and mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the whole crux of... Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I love the cold open of Double Date. Just how the girls are so in sync, and like there's only one word in the entire cold open, and it's mom. And then XTC is Earn Enough for Us plays, and they just like dance around each other in perfect unison and harmony, and it just goes to the heart of their sort of like very connected relationship.
Mm-hmm. And I love how the camera work mimics that too, because there's not one cut in that entire scene as they're dancing around the kitchen. It's just this fluid, almost minute long plus, just elongated scene where they're just, again, like you said, dancing around each other, but the camera doesn't cut, it doesn't pan away, it just lets them do their own thing. And I just love that cinematography, like from a cinematographer's perspective, I love that choice just to like let them play out in that way, because it just parallels how comfortable they are around each other. So I love how that was written, but I love how it was shot too.
Mm-hmm. Good point. I like that.
I mean, and it just goes to the crux of what this entire show, not even the episodes that we're talking about today or what our theme is today, this entire show is just built on the fact that Lorelai and Rory have always just had this best friend dynamic that goes beyond mother and daughter. We see it throughout all 7 seasons in the revival. There's going to be so much that we're going to touch on and talk upon here. But I almost want to like just start us off with a really heavy hitting question. Do you think that it is wise and that it is good to enter into a relationship with your child as a friend first and a parent second?
You're right. That is heavy hitting. And it's a really hard question to answer. I think yes and no. I think you have to be able to strike a balance between having that sort of hierarchical relationship where you are in control and you are able to set rules and parameters and provide discipline in order to help shape that child as they grow and develop and have to make harder and harder choices in their own lives. But I also think on like the friend side, I sort of like Lorelai's approach because I think approaching it in that way allows us to recognize that our children are people too, and that their emotional needs go beyond just doing their homework and um, behaving, right? So just accepting their personhood and getting to know them beyond that sort of I'm in charge and you will do what I say kind of level, I think is maybe something that parenting needs more of sometimes. What about you? Like, what's your take on this?
Um, I think that within the context that we see it play out in the show, it works well enough for Lorelai and Rory, but I don't think this is realistic in terms of how just parenthood is, just how it shakes out in real life in general. And I think there needs to be, I mean, there's no right way to parent. There's a million books out there that will tell you how you should be doing it, what you should do, what you should not do. But I think at the core, there needs to be two predominant ways that you approach raising a child, and there needs to be the functional responsibility and there needs to be an emotional responsibility. And that functional responsibility starts from birth, where the second that child comes out, you're responsible for feeding them, for changing their diaper, for clothing them, for taking care of all those basic human needs that child cannot do on their own. As they get older and they progress into toddlerhood, into becoming a young child, they're able to start picking up on some of that themselves and accomplishing that on their own. And that relieves the parent of some of those functional responsibilities. But that emotional responsibility that the parent has to the child always remains in place. And it's not even something that ends when the child is 18 or 21 or at whatever age an individual is deemed to be an adult or mature. That emotional responsibility is always there. But I think that Lorelai always approached this perhaps a little bit too much from that emotional perspective, where she did all of those basic functional parental responsibilities in terms of, yes, I fed my child, I clothed my child, I changed the diapers. But from the moment that Rory was born, she always saw her as more of a companion and a friend. And I think she should have seen her more as a daughter who needed a little bit more of the functionality and the discipline aspect of that relationship in terms of just emotionally investing in her and seeing her as a friend.
Yeah, that is an excellent take. I think, like I said, you have to have this sort of like balance where on the one end you have Lorelai's very permissive style, and on the other end you'll have someone like Emily or Mrs. Kim, where there's a lot of authoritarian dictates about the way that you must live your life, right? And you need to fall somewhere in the middle where you respect your child's autonomy and they're allowed to be themselves. Lorelai grew up in an environment, Emily herself calls it oppressive, and there's the rub. She's like, why can't we have what you and Rory have? And it's because of everything that Emily put onto Lorelai in her childhood about the right way to live. And Lorelai was so into individuality and expression, and she just was a free spirit who needed to be herself. And so she completely went in the opposite direction with Rory and was overly permissive and was like, as long as you're not hurting anyone, you can do whatever you want. And I think that didn't set quite enough structure for Rory, and it allowed her to just kind of run roughshod over other people sometimes. It was probably more so as she got older and was dealing with more morally complex issues as opposed to when she was a child. It probably worked really well when Rory was little and life was fairly simple. But as she got older, it became more and more difficult. But it was sort of this reactionary decision on Lorelai's part to be like, I'm going to do everything exactly the opposite of my mom. And so we have these two ends of the spectrum, and neither is really a good place to be for a parent. Like, you shouldn't be oppressing your child and not letting them have any freedom, but you also need to provide direction and guidance. And I don't know that Rory got enough of that. I think she was sort of just allowed to run kind of wild. And in some ways, that's good. It allows kids to understand what truly interests them and allows them to pursue their interests and talents on their own terms without all this external pressure. And that's probably why Rory thought she wanted to go to Harvard and why she was such a good student, because she genuinely liked those things and she wasn't pressured into doing them the way so many kids are. But what was lacking was some sort of accountability for some of her actions sometimes. And like I said, when she was a kid, that probably wasn't a huge deal. But as she gets older and starts dating and starts having these more complex
Mm-hmm.
interpersonal relationships, you start to see that like the permissiveness of her childhood leads to this phenomenon where she's totally unable to recognize, like she's so convinced of the righteousness of her actions because she's always been praised and lauded and put on a pedestal. You know, this goes back to some conversations we've already had about how she's treated in Stars Hollow.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's always been used to that. She's been used to being the good girl and never getting in trouble and never faltering when life was easy. But now that life is getting more difficult, she's making the wrong decisions, but she's so convinced of her own correctness in them. And that's where you see some of her worst qualities coming out. Like I'm thinking of when she's really critical of Lindsay in Dosey's Market at the end of season 4, and she's just being very judgmental. And then obviously we have her sleeping with Dean not long after that. She's like, he was mine first, you know,
Oh gosh, don't even get me started.
her entitlement to that and her permissiveness to think that sleeping with someone else's husband is okay because she can do no wrong is, Lorelai tried to teach her to just not hurt anyone else. And in this case, she very much did. She hurt a lot of people with that decision. And yet, she felt pretty bad about it, but she never faced any true consequences for it. She, got a tongue lashing from Teresa. But other than that, she kind of got off scot-free and she got back together with Dean and it didn't work out. But like, there were no other consequences or fallout from that. And I think that's kind of a pattern for her where she's rarely forced to deal with the full consequences of her shittier actions. So I think part of that comes from Lorelai not instilling more discipline and being more of a moral voice in her ear instead of just a sarcastic one. She's just too laissez-faire about it and just kind of let Rory get away with way too much sometimes.
Yeah, there's definitely it comes into play so much more where when you're factoring in someone else's emotional, mental, physical well-being, whatever it is, there's more accountability there that you need to take stock of. And it's very different from any way that Rory might have misstepped as a child where she might just say, I don't really feel like doing my homework or I don't want to have a play date with that person. And those are minimal things where there's no detriment. You're a child just making decisions. But going to what you said, some of those heavy hitting examples, when you're sleeping with a married man, when you're toying around with the emotions of the men in your life that you're interested in, when you're not even being fair to your own mother and your grandparents because you are just way too self-centered for your own good. There are so many examples to draw from, but when you're really hurting other people in a fundamental way like that, that's when you have to realize that it's not okay anymore. And you have to just be a little bit more self-aware to realize that the pedestal that you've been put upon is not a good one, and you need to take responsibility for the damage that you're causing. And I think it's just a direct kind of construct or a fallout from Lorelai raising Rory too much as a best friend and a buddy and not disciplining her well enough where she's not able to take responsibility for anything wrong that she does and can't assume accountability or just recognize how she's hurt other people. So I have to blame Lorelai for that, where you were not the mother there that you should have been.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I wish we could say that we saw it get better over time, but we see in the revival that Rory is still, continuously making some poor life choices, especially as it pertains to the other people in her life, especially the men. And,
Mm-hmm.
That might come out of, like, more directly come out of the way that she's seen Lorelai treat men in her own life. So we talked about this before with the behavioral modeling that she got from Lorelai being subpar, as well as lacking this kind of discipline. But what you said made me think of this episode, episode 12 specifically, Double Date, where Lane just wants to go out to a movie with a guy she's got a crush on, and so they devise a plan where they lie to Lorelai so that she doesn't have to lie to Mrs. Kim. And Rory gets a little bit of like a, hey, your night is over, we're going home now, I have to know exactly where you are, especially when you're wearing my shoes.
Yep.
And then Rory explains, hey, if I told you, I knew you'd have to tell Mrs. Kim because of the mom code, and I didn't want to put Lane in that position. And then Lorelai's like, you lied to me so I wouldn't have to lie to Mrs. Kim? Oh my God, you really are my daughter. Like, recognizing herself in Rory's action here, where the use of subterfuge and diversion was something that she pulled in her own youth, I'm assuming. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, Rory just absorbed too much of that sort of borderline inappropriate behavior from her mom. And yet, I, again, don't think Rory faced any discipline or repercussion from this. Lane got grounded for weeks, and
Mm-hmm.
it took some mom to mom conversation from Lorelai to Mrs. Kim to say, like, hey, Lane's a good kid. She loves you and she respects you, but sometimes you need to give her a little bit of space to, like, do her own thing. Because if I'd had a little space, a little more room to breathe, maybe things would have turned out differently for me. I don't want to see that happen to you guys. If you draw these lines in the sand, you may not be able to cross them someday, and I don't want that to happen. So she's totally right about that. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
comes out of her own philosophy of her own childhood being so strict and difficult to just be herself in. And yeah, Lane just got the book thrown at her while Rory got off scot-free. Lorelai just made a joke out of it. And the same thing happens in Say Goodnight, Gracie, when Lorelai realizes that the fight at the party that made the cops show up was caused by
Mm.
her. And her response is, did you ever know that
That
you're
you're my
my
hero.
hero?
Yep.
Yeah. Um, again, zero fault, zero accountability is ever put on Rory for anything. They just gloss right over it. Lorelai lets her get away with murder, and it's just boop, next, on to the next thing. Let's go.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's one of, and we'll get to this at some point during this episode, but that's one of my top tier worst parenting moments that we see from Lorelai, where she just almost congratulates Rory for what happened with, Jess and Dean ending up fighting over her. And it's just like, oh my gosh, like that's fantastic. Like you have boys fighting. That's not something to be congratulatory about. But
So
it
sure.
yeah. But it just speaks to me about the difference between the boundaries and the obligations that we see and should be playing out between a parent and a child and two best friends. And what are the boundaries that need to be set there and the repercussions for when those boundaries are broken and when things go wrong. And you just think of, like, I just think of the most basic examples where a parent instills a boundary or a rule, so to say, for a child, where it's like, okay, you have to do your homework, and if, or hypothetically, if you go out, I want you home by 9 o'clock at night, and if you're not home by 9 o'clock at night, you're grounded. Friends wouldn't have that going on because you're not responsible for your friend in that way. That's not the relationship that you have, but that's the relationship that a parent has with a child. And I don't think we ever see enough of that from Lorelai with Rory, where she's just she trusts Rory, and Rory is a good kid who is more often than not deserving of that trust. But even when she breaks even the most basic of rules that Lorelai has laid out for her, there should be some discipline or some grounding or some repercussions that Rory needs to face, and she never does. And Lorelai just looks the other way so many times, even when she doesn't come home after going to a dance with Dean and she shows up the next morning. Yeah, her mother berates her a little bit, but I know personally for me, if that had happened to me, I probably wouldn't have left the house for like the next year because I would have just been put on total lockdown by my parents. Um, I don't think Lorelai necessarily disciplines her enough. And because of that lack of discipline, Rory just continues to think like I can do whatever I want and behave however I want to and not be on the receiving end of any sort of negative fallout for my actions. That doesn't translate well down the line, because I just like a really vehement example is you end up committing a felony.
Yes, and I cannot wait to discuss that because I just rewatched those episodes and I have a whole episode on Justice for Rory. But that's neither here nor there. Stay tuned. That'll be like 2024, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, but the point there is just that even when that happens, she thinks like, oh no, I'm just gonna, I'll be fine. Nothing's gonna happen to me here. And when she is on the fallout and has to face, the hammer being thrown down from like, you actually committed a very serious crime here. She's so perplexed, like, what? Like, I have to face consequences? That's never happened because Lorelai didn't parent her well enough in that way to make her understand that yes, when you do things that are wrong, whether it's from a legal standpoint or whether it's from a standpoint of this is not what I have outlined for you as correct behavior within the Gilmore household, there's going to be something that's going to happen from it, and she just can't face it. But I can't fully blame Rory for it. I have to blame Lorelai for poor parenting.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I mean, she probably felt bad a little bit for Rory in that moment because obviously something big happened and she recognizes that Rory's going through it. She picks her up from the police station and Rory tells her about what Mitchum said. And so she knows that Rory is emotionally not doing well and that she regrets doing this in the first place. She's like, oh shit. And now she also knows that Rory has to face consequences legally. So I don't think she wants to pile on by providing her own form of punishment either. But, again, going to kind of like worst parenting moments if you want to. Like, I'm still a little unsure of this myself. Maybe I'll have it worked out by 2024. But I also feel like one of her bad mom moments was just being so stubborn about not letting Logan's dad's lawyers step in and help here.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yes, Rory was going to have to sort of like face the music somehow. But in being so stubborn and just pig-headed about this, Rory ended up getting set up with a lawyer by her grandpa who is overconfident, and they try to make a plea deal that is underwhelming to a judge who clearly has some sort of chip on her shoulder about wealth and privilege, which again, we'll get there. And so Rory ends up with 300 hours of community service, a year's probation, and isn't eligible to have that scrubbed from her record for 5 years. By going with Logan's parents, they probably could have avoided a lot of that. She just didn't want to, allow his family to like get their sticky little paws all over it. But it would have been better for Rory in the long run to not have like a criminal record and to just make it go away and to deal with this some other way. But she just wouldn't allow that to happen. And so she ended up kind of screwing Rory in that process, which, we can have a debate about whether, and we will have a debate about whether Rory's punishment was fair from the judge. But as a parent who wants the best for your child, you're not going to want probation and like a record. So you should do everything you can to prevent that. And when you just let your own feelings get in the way, like that's not your finest moment, Lorelai. But again, that's kind of looking down the road a little. But
Yeah. Eventually, there will be an entire episode on law and the legal system and the justice and lack thereof that Rory
yeah,
faces for that.
kind of my
But
jam, so I'm really excited for that.
yeah, we'll get there. Stay tuned. Again, we're doing this for the next 2 or 3 years, so
Yeah, stay
strap
tuned
in,
to hear me
folks.
go off about sentencing principles. It's gonna be good.
Yeah, but steering us back to this a little bit, uh, we've really been predominantly touching upon the ways and the consequences of parenting a child as a friend and how that can be bad. But I want to start talking about the ways, and not even just with Lorelai and Rory, but just in a general sense, in the way and or ways that you think seeing your child as a friend first and foremost can be good, if there are any positives to that. What do you think?
Mm, right. Okay. I think the thing that comes to mind first is that seeing them as a friend allows you to see them a bit more as an equal. And so you don't want necessarily child parent relationships to be entirely equal, because then you're going to have, kids staying up past their bedtime and not eating their greens and all kinds of stuff. But especially as they get older and that trust builds, it allows you to keep, you know, it's like what Lorelai says in the pilot, where she says, "We've always had a democracy in this house.
Mm-hmm.
We never did anything unless we both agreed. But now I'm going to have to pull the mom card." And so I do think that the concept of democracy in a family is a good thing, to view your kids as people, as human beings with needs and desires and opinions that are worth valuing, instead of just imposing everything on them, which is exactly what Emily did. Even when Rory says she doesn't really want to go to the dance, Emily's like, "Well, of course you're going." Like, just trying to force her into doing something she doesn't want to do. And then Lorelai steps in and rightly says, uh, "Let's see if Rory wants to go, because she doesn't have to. She doesn't want to. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
dance." Right? So I think that allowing your kids to feel like they can come to you as something of a partnership in the family is a good thing for them, because it will allow them to set their own boundaries and to come to you with their problems and not feel like you're only an authority figure that's going to punish them if they do something wrong. They know that they can come to this family as a real part of it and be seen for who they are and appreciated for who they are within that. And to have it be like mutually beneficial, instead of just this like hierarchical top down, that's it, you do as I say kind of relationship. So I like that aspect of their relationship.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it should always necessarily, I don't think it's healthy for it to go both ways, though. And I'll start with saying that, like, a pro to having your child be seen as a friend within the nature of your relationship is good and can be beneficial, because, again, it allows your child to feel comfortable talking to you about things that can be very heavy hitting, detrimental, whether it's bullying at school, whether it's sexual activity once a child reaches that age where they're starting to date and get into relationships, whether it's academic pressure. There are so many things, like just endless things that we can talk about, that a child should and needs to feel comfortable going to a parental or a supervisory figure about. But when you can't instill that trust in your child as a parent to like have them feel comfortable coming to talk to you, they're going to potentially internalize a lot of it if they don't have anybody else that they can speak to about it. There's a lot that can go wrong there. So I do think that's a pro to just seeing your child as a friend, to just instill that sort of trust where it's like, you can talk to me and you can come to me and speak to me in a non-judgmental way, and I'm always going to listen and be here for you and understand what you have to say and try and help you. And I think that's where, like, I think it just needs to be one-sided, where like the child should always feel comfortable going to the parent, but the parent can't go and reverse that and have the child be a confidant for them. And I think that's where Lorelai goes wrong and missteps a lot of the time, because she sees Rory as that confidant and as a friend who I can just gossip with and just vent to about the things that are going wrong in my life. And a lot of that stems from, oh, I'm having, like, she will shit talk her own parents to her child. And I don't love it. And I don't think that's right at all, because Rory is trying at this stage to build a relationship with her grandparents. And so to have her own mother constantly just dumping on them and venting to Rory about all of the things that they've done wrong to her in the past, all of the reasons why she has never been able to have a healthy relationship with them, Rory's going to listen to what Lorelai is saying and really take stock of that, and it's going to hinder her just her capability to have a relationship with her grandparents and build on that in the way that she should. And that's where I think Lorelai, again, it's good that Rory can come to you and talk to you about those things, but that can't be reversed where you're seeing your daughter as a confidant and as a best friend in that regard and talking to her about some of those heavy hitting things. That's where Lorelai needs to go to someone like Suki about it and talk to Suki about those things. But you can't put that on your daughter.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it makes me think of Lorelai's love life as well, because especially as Rory gets older and Lorelai's relationships start becoming more serious, there is sort of an element of any guy involved in Lorelai's life will now be involved in Rory's life, because they are so intertwined that they will inevitably have an impact on each other. So it's interesting to me when they have these conversations about Max really early on, when Rory's only 16, to have, to hear her mom call her teacher sexy, and to find out that they were making out in a classroom and then have the whole school find out about that, like that is a lot. But then as Rory gets even older, say as she's in Yale and Lorelai gets with Luke or Jason, she's in a better position to deal with those kinds of relationships and to maybe absorb a little more from her mom on that front, in terms of like, okay, I can actually be here for you for these things now that I understand them a little better. And we have this sort of like level of separation now that I'm out of the house and it doesn't directly impact me so much. We can be even more so friends than we were before, because it doesn't, like, yes, he's going to be my new daddy, whoever it is, right? But I don't live at home anymore. And so this is, more just me giving you advice as someone who's important to you and knows you really well. So you're right. It should be more so like Rory being able to go to Lorelai than the other way around most of the time. But I can see situations where it is fair and necessary sometimes for Lorelai to also treat Rory as someone who is mature enough and capable enough to be included in her life, because she cares about her daughter and she wants to have a close relationship. And the best way to do that is the mutual trust. So she says it in Double Date. She's like, the trust has to go both ways. And so while it's not always wise to tell her everything, the trust does necessitate that she has to be open to a certain degree with her daughter and tell her the important stuff.
I agree. But I also think that Lorelai needs to recognize too that I feel like sometimes she tries to make Rory just want to come to her about everything. And she can't always realize that, yes, you've established this kind of best friend mantra, but sometimes at the end of the day, Rory is still going to look at you and see you as your mother. And I think of a very specific example where Lorelai invites Dean over for movie night as their first date. And Rory's response was, well, like Lorelai says, like, why are you mad about this? What if Lane had done it? And she's like, well, Lane's my friend. You're my mother. and she has that differentiation. And we even see times when she's gushing to Lane about boys and Dean and Rich and Todd, and like that's the dynamic and the friendship that these two teenage girls have with one another, because they're the same age, they're emotionally at the same sort of standpoint in life. But Rory needs that because, again, like, you need a kind of best friend at that moment who's just like within your age bracket and who will get you in a way that you don't necessarily feel like your mother will. And so Lorelai, I think, should have recognized a little bit better that, like, you're 32, your daughter is 16. It's great that you have this open communication for the most part with one another, but there are still going to be some things that Rory is going to want to go to somebody else about. And there are going to be things that you should be going to somebody else about because it's too mature of a topic for you to be broaching with your teenage daughter. That's why you have friends like Suki, go talk to her about it. There are some times where, yeah, call upon a friend who is just an actual adult at that point, and don't always lean on your daughter, because sometimes that's not emotionally, or even just like, it's just not a responsible thing to do, to put that pressure on your kid when you're dealing with subjects that she's not even ready to handle or tackle herself.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think back to the very end of the pilot when they're sitting in the diner and Rory has agreed to go to Chilton. And Lorelai's like, so tell me about the guy. Like, is he dreamy or is he sexy? I think she uses the word sexy. And I'm like, oh my God, she's 15. Stop.
Yeah.
And then Rory's response is, you always really did understand boundaries. And then Lorelai just keeps pressing the issue. It's like, so tell me about the guy. And it's good to foster a relationship where Rory can tell Lorelai about Dean, because this is her first boyfriend. The trust that Rory has in Lorelai is crucial for Lorelai being able to supervise, if you will, at time, to have that supervisory role to make sure that her daughter is not doing what she did, right? And so she figures the best way to find out what Rory is up to is to be the person that Rory can tell these things to without fear of reprisal, so that Rory wants to tell her things and doesn't want to hide things the way that she had to hide everything from her mom. So by encouraging her to talk about her crushes and talk about how things are going with the boys, she gets Rory to volunteer that information instead of having to try to like read her diary or go through her sock drawer. So that's one of the pros, I suppose, is that it's good that Rory feels comfortable initiating those conversations and volunteering that information without having to be goaded or feel awkward doing it. And that kind of ramps up a little bit in season 3 when she's considering becoming intimate with Jess. And she's able to tell Lorelai that, so that Lorelai is in the loop about when her teenage daughter is thinking about becoming sexually active. And that way she can sort of plan for it and not be shocked to find out, like, oh my God, my daughter is just running around with boys. She does trust her. And the fact that Rory is willing to tell her about it allows her to have that window so that she's not caught off guard, especially by a teen pregnancy or something. You would hope that Rory would try to avoid that for obvious reasons. But it does allow Lorelai the inside track on her daughter's life so that she's not always out of the loop. So that open communication, you do have to know where to draw those boundaries, but it's certainly one of the biggest pros of her style and her philosophy with Rory is allowing Rory to come to her.
Building on that a little bit, as much as Rory most of the time feels comfortable coming to Lorelai about things, and Lorelai is able to guide her in the best way that she knows how as a parent, considering that, she was still just, navigating the waters of adulthood herself as she was trying to raise her own child. I want to ask a about moments where you feel like Lorelai should have pulled out the mom card, but she didn't.
Oh. Dang, that's a good one. I feel underprepared for this, which is like not a normal feeling for me. Should have pulled out the mom card. There are probably a bunch. What about you? Like, why don't you get this started? And it might jog my memory because like it's such an interesting question where it could go either way. How she responded to things. So there for the moment aren't any that stick out to me other than the ones we've kind of already touched on in it. So give me a sec to like marinate. What do you think?
One that sticks out to me is when Rory decides to drop out of Yale.
Oh. See, I actually don't think, because that was one time she did try to pull the mom card and
but
it
not
backfired.
Not enough. Well, okay, go on. Yeah.
Like, do you really think it would have been better if Rory had been forced to stay at Yale? Like, if she had been coerced or something to continue on when she needed a break to stop and recalibrate? I think Lorelai's, I mean, her initially going to her parents to try to talk some sense into Rory might have been ill-advised. But I think as tough as it was to watch, her trying to let Rory make her own decision about it and go back when she felt ready, like when she sort of backed off of that hardline stance of, I'm not going to make you do this, but I'm also not going to condone it. And until you rectify it yourself, you know, I'm not going to enable you. Right. In the end, it was kind of the right call because Rory needed to feel the motivation and the passion intrinsically to succeed at Yale. And she was able to get back there herself. And she was able to get back on the horse with a kick in the right direction from Jess, unlikeliest of sources that he was. And I think if she had been forced by anyone, it wouldn't have done her any good. So, as unfortunate as it was to see their relationship struggle through that, it was what was necessary for Rory at that time. She needed to step up as an adult and really take ownership and decide for herself what her path was going to look like on her own time frame. And Lorelai stepping back and letting her do that was ultimately what worked. Richard and Emily stepping in to play the parental card didn't work on Rory either because they just stepped in and pulled their usual tricks of coercion and manipulation. And, you know, Richard even wanted to try to bribe her, and Lorelai had to put him in his place and say, that's not going to work on Rory. She used to love to learn. She needs to want to go back. And so her initial stance of, well, go to Harvard or take some classes or whatever, like, that may not have been the best thing for her. Rory needed to sort it out emotionally first before she would have been mentally ready to take on an Ivy League course load.
And she wasn't from her freshman year. I mean, we have a moment where she meets with a professor that she's taking a course with, and the professor is like, this is a subpar paper that you've just submitted. I've talked with your advisor. I think you're taking on too heavy of a course load. And Rory is not able to come to terms with the fact that, yeah, perhaps she has bit off more than she can chew. And her response is, oh, well, that's what my grandfather did, and I should be succeeding at the level that he did. You can't relate yourself to your grandfather in that way. You need to succeed at Yale in the way that you are going to succeed at Yale, and that's going to be your own path and your own journey to take. And when she can't necessarily find the success at Yale, but also in life, like, she never does well with it, and Rory always just sort of shuts down and breaks down and just really closes herself off and doesn't handle like things well at all when she's not as successful as she wants to be. It's not just with Yale, it's not just with that particular course. We see it with Mitchum and in her internship. We see it with her wanting to pursue journalism and never really getting there or obtaining that career path that she wanted. But I would have liked to have seen her be a little more confident in herself. And just going back to how that could potentially tie into the topic that we're addressing here today, I wish Lorelai would have just mothered her a little bit better and maybe not been so much of a friend, and in that moment just to say, like, a friend is someone who might encourage you and support you when things are not going well, and push for you to want to do better. But they're not always going to take the same sort of investment that a mother potentially would, in terms of breaking down, like, why aren't you succeeding? What is it that you want? There's a different dichotomy to that relationship. And I feel like Lorelai felt short there in the motherhood aspect of just, you just always assumed that your daughter was going to succeed, and you never had a plan B in place for yourself when she didn't, and how you were going to mother her through it.
Yes, those are all good points. But I also, to me, I think there's a difference between mothering and being a good mom in that moment versus playing the mom card. And to me, the mom card is like when you really have to step in and make an executive decision on someone else's behalf, or lay down the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a situation. That's why I was saying that, like, I don't think laying down the law in that moment was the right call for Rory. But you're right, she should have been more supportive, because I think you hit the nail on the head by saying neither of them had a plan B for if journalism didn't work. And that's why I think it was important for Rory to take time off and not be forced back into Yale, because that's like a $50,000 a year school at that time, like it's more now. It's nearly 60. Actually, it's probably closer to 40 then, and 60 now. And it's like, you don't mess around with that much tuition going willy-nilly. You should be focused and you should be motivated and driven to succeed there, because it's the only way you will survive. And Rory had already burned out once, as you so rightly pointed out. So it was not a moment where force was going to help. She needed the time away to work on herself and to figure out another option if she really truly didn't believe journalism was for her. And in the end, she came back to journalism, which, if you ask me, was a bad call, because it was just a bad time for journalism. It wasn't even just that Rory was underprepared for it or not competent at it. I think she's a great writer, but journalism requires being more than a great writer. And she may not have had all of the skills as much as she would need to succeed somewhere like the New York Times. So I think it would have been good for her to rethink maybe being a writer or a professor or something. We'll talk about this more when we get to the revival, but Charleston suggests she should go back to Chilton and teach. And I think that would have been a perfect fit for her. She loves academia. She loves English literature, writing. She could be the faculty rep for the Franklin. It would be the perfect fit for her. But she resists it so much because she's got this like one-track mind about journalism, and she will not let it go. So much so that she takes an extremely low-paid job at the Stars Hollow Gazette in order to feel like she's living out her fantasy, even though it's clear that it's not working out for her. And so if she had maybe been able to take some time to self-reflect and adapt in college, that would have been the best thing for her. But instead, she got saddled with 300 hours of community service and had to just kind of get by and work at the DIR for a little bit of money on the side to keep things going. And so she just sort of went back to plan A without realizing why it failed in the first place. She was just coaxed into going back by Jess being like, why aren't you at Yale? Because she's like, she thought that an Ivy League institution was the only way and that journalism was the only way. And so that's what Jess is reacting to when he does that to her. it's not because he knows her better than anyone. But you haven't seen her in 2 years. Get out of here with that. She's not the same girl she was in high school, and you have no idea what you're dealing with here. But he knows that she had this path, and so he's like, it's not so much that it's no longer her, but she's deviated from what she thought she wanted. And so maybe if she had actually taken some time to put in the legwork to explore her other options, she may have avoided some struggles later or been able to handle those struggles better and pivot with more ease. So I wish I had seen that for her. But going back to the mother-daughter friendship at hand, in that scene in A House Is Not a Home, Lorelai also does the same thing to her where she just stonewalls her and says, no, you're staying at Yale. You have to do this. I don't care if you end up being a journalist or not, but like, you're going to stay at Yale. And doesn't allow Rory to explain herself, or I don't even know if Rory fully understands it herself yet. She doesn't give her any space to do that exploration. And I think that's where, you know, a more flexible approach to mothering would have come in handy. She was just so, again, one-track mind, because they are the same person, that neither of them saw the opportunity that was for a change where Rory would feel fulfilled and confident instead of like she's questioning her path. I think Mitchum was right to make her question her path. Yet another episode that will get an entire devoted discussion.
Yep.
But yeah, that it's not one of the moments I think that Lorelai should have laid down the law, but she should have been there to work through it with Rory instead of going behind her back to Richard and Emily and trying to force her into something that she didn't want. She'd always been someone who took into consideration what Rory wanted to do. And that's one of the moments where she failed at that. And it backfired big time on everyone and gave us half of season 6. So, yeah, not one of her finest moments of parenting, but not because it was a moment that required a mom card.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Transitioning us a little bit from now, talking about Rory's education and how Lorelai factored in there as a mom versus a best friend. I want to talk a little bit more, just a little bit, about how Lorelai was either a really good friend and wingwoman to Rory in terms of guiding her through relationships with Dean, with Jess, with Logan, through all of her successes and her triumphs and her missteps, and the ways in which she should have laid down the hammer, so to say, a little bit more and said, like, that's not how you approach a relationship or treat a guy. It's, to an extent, some things that we've already discussed on already in previous episodes, and I think that's something that we'll get into a little bit more, especially when we do our motherhood episode. But are there just any quickly just really noticeable examples of moments within Rory's relationship with guys where you think Lorelai succeeded as a mother and or a friend, or just abysmally failed?
Okay, the abysmal failure was, I think, the Dean situation in Say Goodbye to Daisy Miller, where she was trying so hard to be Rory's friend that, you know, that was one of the moments where Rory needed her ass handed to her by her mom. And her mom was like, I thought you might want to talk about this as a friend, and as your friend, I think it's a bad idea. And it gave Rory the chance to back away and not engage and be like, well, I'm just, your reaction wasn't what I wanted, so I'm going to, you know, not take your input on this. I think that was one of those moments where Lorelai really needed to step in with a firmer hand and more guidance and just really hammer home exactly, but like, you know, not too harshly or like, you're grounded, because she's 20, you know, or 19, I guess, at this point. You know, there's only so much you can do discipline wise, but the moral guidance was just completely lacking. She just wanted to be there as a girlfriend so that Rory would open up about it and tell her more so that maybe they could repair the fight. But that was one of those moments where you really needed to be like, this is not okay, and this is why. she tried, but there's just something missing there that needed further reinforcement. And then, a few episodes later, she's sticking up for her to Teresa in the town square. And then after that, it's like all is forgotten. So she's just way too quick to forgive and to be like, hey, let's go on a double date with Dean and Luke. Just way too accepting of what happened and of that relationship. I mean, the shit's already out of the horse with what happened, but you don't have to encourage it or enable it further after that. So that was a little rough. As to where she succeeded, I think she really did give some good advice to Dean along the way, which is ironic because it wasn't always to Rory herself, but to Dean himself. She also provided some good advice to Jess when, in Face Off, he was being uncommunicative with Rory and wasn't staying in touch, telling her that, oh, sorry, I can't tonight. I got to work till midnight. I only get like 2 minutes to give you a call. Sorry. Let's try again tomorrow. She put him in his place with that. So that was a good one. But, I think some of her wins, I'm thinking of when she's talking to Rory about Dean in P.S. Ayla, when she goes out to Hartford and picks her up and says, again, we've had this conversation, be like, I don't want to think that I raised a kid who couldn't say I love you. That, I think, it's a good moment. It does underline Lorelai's own deficiencies, but at least she's willing to have that conversation and help support Rory back into that relationship because she knows it's what Rory wants. And now she seems to think Dean wants it as well and might be willing to forgive. So she goes and she has that conversation. So I think that's a win. I don't know. There have to be more. She helps her get back together with Logan. She helps sort of repair that relationship as well down the line. When Logan tries everything and even goes to Lorelai. I think that was a smart move on his part. And I think it was good for Lorelai to step in and give Rory some, maybe give him some grace kind of advice. So what about you? What do you think?
I think you've touched on all of the biggest and most important ones that I would have brought up myself. But I think it's worth noting too that Lorelai was a really good friend to her daughter, but she was also a really good friend to her daughter's friends. And it's what you said. She was always a good friend to Dean. And I mean, I say friend, but in terms of guidance offered and a support system, she was a really good friend and or advisor to Dean, to Lane, to Jess, to Logan. When she saw
Paris.
Definitely to Paris. And I mean, and we see that's one of I'm glad you brought that up. And it's not something that I'm going to tangentialize us on here, but what we see in the revival with how Paris treats Lorelai in terms of the grace and the compassion and just reverence for Lorelai that what she offers her in the revival. I love seeing how Paris essentially was just like, you were the mother to me that I never had. And Lorelai was not Paris's mother. She was always just more of a guidance figure, but she was a friend to Paris in the same way that she was a friend to her own daughter at a lot of the times where she was able to guide her in the same way.
Louise says it in Concert Interruptus, where she's like, she's more like a big sister. So I think that's kind of a good way to describe it, where it is more like a sisterly relationship than a motherly relationship. And sometimes an older sister can have a very influential mother-like impact on a younger sister. So that makes total sense to me. And yes, you make an excellent point that, Lorelai is someone that other people can go to with their problems because she's not going to be judgmental and she's not going to try to parent them necessarily, but she is going to be a sympathetic ear and someone who has good things to say, has wisdom to share. So it's really nice that she's able to foster relationships with her daughter's friends and other people around town that they feel comfortable going to her with things that, they couldn't be so transparent about with their own parents.
Mm-hmm.
But this also makes me think of another fail. It occurred to me a moment ago. Another major fail on Lorelai's part as it pertains to Rory's guys is Paul and what happens in the revival. And
Mm-hmm.
they ran way too far with that shtick. Paul deserved better. Hashtag justice for Paul. Like, she was way too accepting of the fact that Rory was ghosting her boyfriend of 2 years. Nobody could remember his name. She has a girl chat with Rory in that hotel room in New York after Rory has a one-night stand with a Wookiee. And that's just not okay. She doesn't seem to give her any flack for the fact that she's sleeping with an engaged guy, cheating on her own boyfriend, and just had a one-night stand with someone completely different.
Yeah, and it's telling too because you gave Rory so much heat over sleeping with Dean as a married man, but you're unwilling
Where's the
to.
consistency?
Yeah, like, and I get whether I don't want to get too much into it, whether that was right, whether that was wrong.
We'll get there.
What Laura, we'll get there. We'll talk about it. Lorelai's response to that scenario. But how can you come down on her for sleeping with Dean as a married man in such a harsh way, but then forgive this behavior now where you called it perfectly? You're treating Paul like he's just a piece of garbage that's been kicked out to the curb, that doesn't matter, that has no significance in your life, that you're not being faithful to him when that's probably something that he was expecting and or hoping for. You've got to be consistent with calling out your daughter's bad behavior if you want to parent her in that way, but Lorelai doesn't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a bad one. Yeah. What do you think about the way that they portray single motherhood? You know, like they're sort of portraying this as mother and daughter as close as can be. They were, destined the way Chris says in the revival,
Mm-hmm.
like, no one was getting between you. And they sort of make it seem like this really tight mother-daughter relationship was fun and effortless. And it just made Lorelai seem like she was just so great at everything. But the fact that Rory didn't really have a stable father figure was just treated as sort of an afterthought, or like dads were nice to have but kind of unnecessary. Like, do you have any particular thoughts on the way they tried to make it seem like Lorelai was Wonder Woman and could just do it all, and sort of the impact that has by cutting Chris out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's always important within this show, but within the context of any show, especially with something that is so much more, not that this is like reality based, but it's so much more real life, and you see relationships that are transparent and can be relatable to people who are watching this show. I think it's always important to convey that, at the end of the day, you're watching what is fictional television, and these are not real people, these are not real relationships, these are not, like, this doesn't exist in the world. And it's very possible that, yeah, a mother and daughter in real life can have a similar relationship to what Lorelai and Rory have in the show, but I think it's so much more uncommon than not. And again, I just don't think on the whole that it's a good uh parenting strategy to try and approach things in the way that Lorelai did. So to answer your question, I wish there had been a little more, I guess, just struggle within the show, and a little bit more strife and controversy between mother and daughter, you know, than what we get, because not everything is as gravy as what we see within 7 seasons between a mother and daughter relationship in that way. And I worry that there can be viewers of this show and audience members who are seeing that, who think, I want to, I can be a single mother and I can parent my daughter in that way, and it's going to play out the exact same way. And circumstances aside, people are single parents for whatever reasons. They, your circumstances are your own. You can be single fatherhood, and we see that in the show too. But it's dangerous, I think, for anyone who's watching this to assume that you can have what Lorelai and Rory had and even aspire to and want that in the same way, because you need to make parenthood and your relationship with your child your own, and you can't have it be based on something that you see on TV.
Yeah, I think her approach of like putting that pressure on herself to do it only by herself and not let anyone else in really alienated the people around her. And you're right, it's not really realistic to see it play out so well in real life. Like, Chris is treated like such an afterthought most of the time. They just sort of like assume the worst in him most of the time, and he's just cut out a lot and is made to feel inferior to Lorelai. Like he puts her on a pedestal as well. You can see it in the way he talks about her and how he's like, "Oh, you're Wonder Woman, and you know, you did such a great job raising her, and I never could have lived up to that." But it's because she never gave him a chance to be that guy. So, yeah, it's not realistic to how hard it really is. Because I think one of the key things is that we miss those years of struggle, like those early years in the Independence Inn, when they're living in a shed and they have nothing. And so we're just sort of fast forwarded to this place, obviously, for narrative reasons in terms of Rory being a really interesting character and there being sort of that parallel of Rory being the age that Lorelai was when she got pregnant. So we miss all that other stuff. And it seems like they're at a point where things are stable and happy and their relationship is really good. And it puts this nice shiny patina on it. It sanitizes how difficult it is to be a single mother. And yeah, I think it's not always the most realistic thing. So
yeah, I don't foresee us ever getting it, but I would have just loved to have seen just the early years of them living in the shed together. If there was ever a spinoff to be made, and not even a revival, just a spinoff, I would have loved to have seen Rory and Lorelai's relationship as she's an elementary school child and Lorelai is raising her in this inn, because I think it would have been very telling and it would have answered a lot of the unanswered questions that we as viewers still have now. But
yeah, it's true. And then there's also the theme song. So like kind of going back to that point of coming full circle, Rory being 16 at the start of the show, where you lead, I will follow. It's funny because I actually heard an anecdote about Carole King not loving that song originally when she first recorded it, because the initial sort of thrust of it was very stand by your man, very much follow your man wherever he wants to go, despite what you want. And so she sort of jumped at the chance to re-record it when Amy asked her if they could use it for the theme song, because she was able to reframe it as this cute mother-daughter thing. And it's just so iconic now. But do you think that the where you lead, I will follow thing is good? Like what do you think about this sort of full circle mentality with the parenting and the parallels and all of these things?
No, I don't think it's healthy. And I think that it's something that we've said before. I think that Rory just absorbs too much of Lorelai's personality, where she's just always so mindful of what her mother thinks, how her mother comports herself, how she behaves, and she makes a lot of that her own. And the second that she does it, it just relieves her of any autonomy and individualistic personality traits that she might have just picked up on her own time and her own being. And I even think she does the same with Emily and Richard, and maybe even like more so with Emily, where Rory very much compartmentalizes the traits that she sees within her own family members, and she takes not all the time, but she sometimes makes their own viewpoints her own, and she makes their own personality traits her own. And I don't love for Rory to see Rory doing that, and I don't want to see anyone ever do that, because you need to be your own person. You need to form your own opinions, be your own self, live life the way that you want to. And to see Rory again, especially with Lorelai, just follow in her mother's footsteps almost so identically, and to have her path play out almost in the same way, it makes me grieve for Rory, because I just feel like her life was so diminished and not as fulfilled or as just open and engaging as it could have been had she just been her own person and not like taken in so much of what Lorelai instilled.
Yeah. One of the things I like best about their relationship is that they connected so much through culture and through like sharing tastes. And I think that's a good thing. That is one of the good parts of the friendship, right? Where it's sort of that neutral ground where they can really come together, that's not so emotionally charged and dealing with difficult issues and love lives and boundaries and all those kinds of things. I think, that's a really great way to connect with people, is through sharing movies and music and books and fiction,
Mm-hmm.
narrative stories. They've clearly worked that into their relationship. Rory even explicitly addresses it in her graduation speech about, I've been a resident of all of these worlds, but my own world is populated with characters that are like just as fantastic. And like the greatest of these is my mother. She never gave me any idea that I couldn't do anything that I wanted to do or be anything that I wanted to be. So, that was a really interesting moment for her to phrase it like that. And I enjoy that. But like you said, I think it maybe went too far, where she just absorbed and automatically liked what her mom liked. And those superficial things that they could have been connecting over spilled into just like the complete like subsuming of Rory's own personality.
Mm-hmm.
It just, even Dean calls it out. He's like, you want to make one of your pro con lists, consult your mother. Like, I use that quote a lot because
it's just a good one.
Yeah, they need to be called out on it. They share everything, including opinions, apparently. So there are good things about it, but when it goes too far and it just becomes the apple not falling far from the tree, and Rory just making the same mistakes despite all of their efforts to prevent such things, that's where it gets into dodgy territory of, okay, this was a fun narrative device for a minute there, but now we've just stepped into this is cringy and I don't like it territory, especially in the revival.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's
Yep. Kind of as we just continue on with this, I want to start talking about just let's highlight best and worst moments from
we should do this like
Lorelai.
lightning round style. Like ping,
I
ping,
mean,
ping, ping.
lightning round is hard because there are so many to call upon, and so many that are just worthy and can be discussed in greater detail. But sure, we can give this a shot to try and bring up as many as possible that are important to us. We'll start with Lorelai. One of the best moments that you think you see from her within the show.
When Rory's freaking out over her first date with Dean, and Lorelai gives her really good advice. Good advice. You can see that Rory really notices and respects Lorelai's, or admires, I guess respects is the wrong word. She admires Lorelai's easy charm, and she wants to emulate that. And Lorelai steps in and helps her. I mean, and that also kind of leads me to my first worst moment, which is Lorelai inviting Dean in the first place, because she was
Mm-hmm.
inserting herself too much into her daughter's life and putting her under fire with this date. She claimed she was just trying to be cool and show Rory she was okay with it, but like there was clearly more to that. So she's the one who made this happen in the first place, but she still offers good advice and is not too overbearing as a mother in the situation, at least.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? What's one of
Yeah,
her
it's
best
so
moments?
hard because like she has good moments, but like it's hard to differentiate sometimes. Like, what's a good moment that stems from you just being a good mother versus you being a good friend? So there's so many to call upon. I will say a good moment that Lorelai has that I think stems from more of her just trying to be a good friend to her daughter is just seeing her daughter's first night at college and how uncomfortable she
Mm-hmm.
is and how unwilling she is to necessarily want to be left alone in her dorm. And Rory calls her and just says like, I don't care who knows it, I need my mommy, and Lorelai comes back and gets food and opens up the room and kind of makes sure, like, she just ensures that Rory's first night there is not as unpleasant as Rory was envisioning it being, and she just helps her daughter settle in a little bit better. And it's again, like, it's so hard to say, like, is that a good mom moment or is that a good friend moment? I just saw that like as something like maybe a little bit of both, but I just saw her just being a good friend to her daughter in that moment and recognizing like she's uncomfortable. Let me do what I can to try and just let this evening pass a little more stress free for her.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite episodes. I love that one. Good pick.
Worst moment. Yeah, it's I'm gonna go back to something that we said before. Probably not getting her daughter the legal counsel that she would have needed in the aftermath of, again, committing a felony. Your daughter's in some very serious hot water right now. Um, you needed to not be her friend here, and you needed to actually be her mother and step in and realize she's facing some various serious repercussions. She's not going to get off the hook here unless you call in every available favor that you can to try and do that. And I don't even know if that would have been the right method either, because then it just allows Rory to, skate by and get off scot free as she's so used to. And we'll get into it. I think Rory did need to face the music there, and I'm glad that she did to an extent. But I think Lorelai was a little too la di da with not recognizing that you need to address this here because this is a very serious problem.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
For me, another best one is when Lorelai gives her ninth row aisle seats to the Bengals to
mhm.
Rory, Paris, Madeline, and Louise, because, you know, she sees how much Rory is struggling at Chilton, and she really just wants to facilitate her making some friends there and thinks it will be a good bonding experience for them. So, like, she gave up something that she wanted so that her daughter could benefit. Daughter slash best friend. Like, that was a friend move right there. I don't think it was so much a mother move. It was a friend move.
Yeah. And in the
That was
same
a good
episode,
wing woman moment.
it definitely was. And we got to give Suki a shout out there too, because it was also Suki's ticket. Like, Suki could have just been like, excuse me, I really wanted to see this concert and enjoy it from the amazing epic seat that we had purchased. And Suki also there really stepped into, like, a really great like aunt role for Rory, just recognizing like, yeah, this girl's gotta form these friendships. And so I have to shout out Suki there. But in the same episode, another moment that I love that we see from Lorelai, and this is not so much a you're being a good friend moment, but again, just being a good mother moment, is when she realizes that Madeline and Louise have just completely left the concert and gone off with two guys to this party in the city, that they have only met that evening. And Lorelai goes after them and brings them back and says like, nope, we're leaving right now. We're going home. This is not okay. Um,
Excellent mom card moment.
yeah, you needed to pull out the mom card there, and you did. Madeline and Louise were you don't know these guys, you don't know these people, you don't know what would have happened that night, if anything could have and would have gone wrong. It was absolutely correct for Lorelai to step in and just be like, nope, I'm pulling you out of this party, out of this situation, and we're going home right now. So shout out to her for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, I think another best moment that I really love, I just watched this episode recently, is in To Live and Let Diorama. Or sorry, no. Is it the next one? It might be the beginning of But I'm a Gilmore. When she brings, yes, it's But I'm a Gilmore. When she brings Rory hangover burritos.
Yes.
like walks her through her first really bad hangover. Like that's a solid friend moment right there. Most moms wouldn't do that, and so that to me is like clutch friend.
Yeah, everyone needs good hangover food. Got to rebound somehow. So yeah, but let's talk about, like, we've talked about Lorelai. Some of Rory's best moments and worst moments.
Ooh, Rory had some good ones too.
I'll kick it off. I'm gonna say that this always felt to me more like a friend looking out for a friend than a daughter looking out for a mother. But I will never not watch this scene in this moment and not almost like, and not even almost, I will be brought to tears and just love it. Her graduation from Chilton and the lead up to that, where she goes to Emily and Richard and says, I need money for Yale. And she's not fully transparent on why, but she's signing herself back into this almost sort of contract with Emily and Richard, as if to say, like, I need money. Please lend it to me. I'll pay you back. I will reinstate Friday night dinners. And she says, because funding fell through, but the real reason is because she just wants her mother and Suki to be able to put in a bid for a new inn and a new retail, like a new space for that. And Lorelai doesn't immediately know that, but that is top tier to me in terms of Rory just taking on a debt and a substantial student debt, whether Emily and Richard ever, make her pay it back. Like, and that's a point of contention, but just that she's willing to even enter into that potential situation to see her mother and her mother's best friend be successful. I love that scene. And I love that in the aftermath, like, just and a follow-up, she just calls on it. And her whole graduation speech, just acknowledging her mother and wanting to always be that person. And what always stuck out to me was that when she is having that speech and she's acknowledging Emily and Richard, and then she transitions to acknowledging Lorelai, if you watch it back, she always says, like, my greatest inspiration comes from my best friend, from whom I have my namesake. And it could have been written where she said, like, my greatest inspiration comes from my mother, but the line is that my inspiration comes from my best friend. And I think that's very telling in that moment, that that's always how Rory first and foremost saw Lorelai. So
yeah. And playing off of that, one of Rory's worst moments was missing Lorelai's graduation from community college because she ditched school to go to New York to see Jess. That was a low point, and everybody knew it.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
You've got the best.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to start on the next thing, so if you have like a point to follow up on.
Nope, that's it.
I was going to give a best moment for her. When she rushes from Yale and like Logan lets her borrow a car to get to Lorelai after Luke breaks up with her, and she sets her up with everything she needs, and she's willing to go out into the town to stock up her mom on snacks and food and things that will comfort her, and she rushes in to support her. That I love that. That's more of like a friend thing than a daughter thing to me.
Yeah, their relationship is really, it's always like, it's a hard and it's a contentious one sometimes, and they do have their struggles, and there are times when they don't speak to one another, where there are bridges that have to be rebuilt and things that need to be reconciled. But from what we get from them throughout all 7 seasons and their revival, their relationship has always just been a really beautiful one to me, despite the challenges of it. I don't think it's something that we should necessarily idealize or hope to aspire to, because again, this is television and it's not, meant to be real life, and that's not necessarily how things play out. But I can just appreciate it from a viewer standpoint and from a Gilmore Girls, lover. You've never seen a mother-daughter relationship like that on TV, and I don't know if we'll ever get one ever again like that, nor would I want one, because I think they hit Amy and Daniel hit a home run here.
Yeah. Actually, I have a few more like moments before we totally wrap this segment. I've got a few more for Lorelai specifically. Taking Rory to Atlantic City for her 21st birthday.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't so much like a moment as sort of like an arc for an episode, but I really love the dynamic between them when they're in Martha's Vineyard, in the Vineyard Valentine episode, where they've just reconciled from their long separation. And, Rory really is growing up, and she's in a pretty serious relationship here with Logan. And they get to exist like true equals in this episode. They're cooking in the kitchen together, and Lorelai's really seeing how grown up she is in thinking that like Logan could be the one for her. And I think it's a really nice episode where Logan and Rory invite Lorelai and Luke as if they're friends and not like parental figures to spend Valentine's at his family's house. And then a bad one is when Lorelai decides to elope with Christopher in France and does not include Rory. Oh, that's so bad. So bad. But then one more that's really great that came to mind was when Rory gets an opportunity to make a connection with someone at the New York Times, and Lorelai steps in to help execute on Lane's baby shower.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we were really like skewing to the earlier seasons, and I was like, I gotta get some season 6 and 7 in there. So,
yep,
yeah. So we got those. But yes, you're right. It's such a unique relationship. Like what other 18-year-old girl wants to go on a Europe trip for the entire summer with their mom, right? And come back and they're still in a good place relationship wise. Like, it's so delightful to see the possibilities of motherhood that exist, where you can maintain your own interests and still be your own person, and you can allow your child to be their own person, and you can coexist as this unit that has friendship and trust baked into it, and you don't have to play these power differential games where like, I'm the mom, I make the rules around here, and you're going to do what I want you to, in the same way that like Emily kind of tries to step in and dictate Lorelai's life and then later Rory's life as well. So you're right. It's an extremely special relationship. And I think we should like leave off with a last question where it's like, is she a good mom or a bad mom?
That's such a loaded question.
Yeah, bring it right back to the beginning, full circle, on brand, on theme. Like, what's your take on this question? Or what do you think the writer's take on this question was with the show? Like, is there some sort of value judgment that they're making by portraying it like this? Or like, do you have any thoughts about that?
Several that I will elaborate on more in our motherhood episode that we eventually do. But to very quickly and as concisely as I can answer that question, do I think Lorelai is a good mother? On the whole, yes. She falls short in a lot of ways that are just intrinsic and very specifically related to Rory. But if I have to generalize and answer that question based on what can and does go wrong in the world with how abhorrent parents can be and hold her to that standard and measure her up against anyone else, like, yes, she is a great parent. If I'm answering the question in that way, if I'm answering it in the sense of, is she a good parent to Rory just based on their specific relationship, and I'm just looking at them one-on-one concisely, I don't think I would be as adamant to say, like, yes, she is a good parent. Because she does misstep and she does falter a lot. I don't know how much we can hold that against her because she became a mom at 16. That's its own uphill battle for anyone who's facing that. So yeah, she did the best that she could, and I really think that at the end of the day, yes, she was the best mother that she could potentially be, and that she always strived to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I concur with the fact that, like, she's the best that she could be because she still had some deficiencies from her own emotional upbringing where there were certain elements of maturity that she lacked.
Mm-hmm.
But on the whole, I think, yes, when you sort of take a step back and look at the entirety of it, and they had their problems. No mother is perfect. No human is perfect. So when you consider it on the whole, things turned out pretty well for them.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time she did what she had to do. She provided for her daughter both functionally and emotionally as best as possible, and managed to maintain a good relationship with her in a way that her own mother couldn't. So I think Amy Sherman Palladino herself said that, there's more than one way to be a good mom.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who's sort of criticized them on, like, oh, a real mom would never do that. She's like, well, who's to say? And there's more than one way to be a good mom. And I completely agree with that. So she's not a perfect mom, but she's pretty darn good. And I think a lot of people would take her over their own parents. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a win. She has some areas where she could have done better, but who doesn't?
Exactly. Yeah. I concur. And yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap this up and end it. We'll talk about, again, more when we get to the motherhood episode, and we'll delve a little bit deeper into the finer points of that when we get there. But in the meantime, what do we have coming up next week? What's our next topic?
I'm really excited for next week. We're actually going to be talking about nostalgia.
Ooh.
Yeah, I think this show holds such a nostalgic place in so many people's hearts. It's from some of our childhoods. It's old enough now that it takes on sort of like a period place in our minds. Like, God, the early aughts. Remember that? Wow.
I do. Yeah.
Ooh. Yeah. So we're sort of going to talk about the nostalgic elements of the show and how the fandom is nostalgic for the show itself and various different elements that are sort of related to that. And I think it's going to be really great. I've got some interesting notes on it that I'm excited to dig into a little more. So stay tuned for that. The first one of 2023.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we're not taking a Friday off. We'll be here with you consistently week after week. So please just keep joining us for these episodes. You can catch us every Friday evening live. If you, in the meantime, want to get more Gilmore Girls content, go back and watch some of the episodes we've already done in the past. We have social media. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description below. But the biggest thing that you can do, and what we will always appreciate, is just the support here on YouTube. Please just like this video, subscribe to our channel. That will help us out the most. And we will always be grateful for that. But in the meantime, this is our last episode of 2022. And we're about to ring in the new year in actually
tomorrow.
Tomorrow. So whatever time zone you're, like, it's going to be the new year for all of us. So just a very happy and healthy 2023 to you. We hope that you achieve everything that you want to in the year to come, and just that you garner all the happiness that you can. And yeah, just be happy, and yeah, just be kind to one another.
Yeah. Isn't that somebody else's sign off? I don't know.
I don't know, but it's good advice, sage advice anyway. Just be happy and be kind.
Yeah. That is very, very true. The happiest of New Year's. I hope that, if 2022 was rough for you, you can leave it in the dust and start fresh in a few days' time. And hopefully we will see you next Friday for dinner. Mm-hmm. Bye.
Bye. Happy New Year.